So to me, there's always, if you learn where you can save a ton of time and where you can waste time and you become better and better at mastering that tool set, I think that will make a really big difference in what we see as a really strong developer in the future. When you're building these tools, you want people to just start and play around. You don't want them to first like log into a whole bunch of different services and then they can do something, right? So anything we can do to reduce that big friction and make sure that the AI can have its own account in a way and just work there.
You're listening to the AI Native Dev, brought to you by Tesla.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the AI Native Dev podcast. Today, we're going to talk about AI and the web and where is it headed and how to deal with that. And to help us explore all of that world and more, we have Matt Biillmann, who is the CEO and co-founder of Netlify. Matt, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So Matt, we're going to talk a lot about web and AI, but looking at your background, I realized that you started your LinkedIn profile in 2 years of being a music editor in those. And so I'm going to start by asking you a totally different question, which is, what's your view on AI and music generation? You're a fan, you're pro, you're against?
In all of the creative fields, right? I think it's just going to be a new tool in our toolbox to be creative with. I think when people look at AI and music, a lot of them are thinking of like the low hanging, or AI can generate music that sounds just like the music that we've been listening to for a while now. And that's cool. There's probably like a lot of fun use cases for that, right? But I think more interesting with these things is what are like creative artists gonna do with what you can do with AI that was impossible to compose or come up with or put together before you had this capacity of maybe generating things with a level of complexity or a level of who knows, right? That you just couldn't do before. And again, I probably wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if I wasn't generally a fan of technology and the possibilities it opens up to just so many other changes in music, from the invention of the musical notation technology that really changed what people even thought was music. Before, it was always just tied to something that existed in a moment. Then the invention of the gramophone again completely changed what people even thought about as music, because before that, like the actual sound of music was something ephemeral that only existed in the moment. And so suddenly just recording it really changed like completely what people thought of as music. And again, very early on, you would just record classical Western music, right? I can put that out. But then so much of what people listen to and think of this is music to them today started because you could record music and you could spread it as that, right? And then the digital recording came around and suddenly you had samples, right? Like, and in the beginning, at that time, there was a lot of the similar thoughts that around like AI, right? Oh, it's like stealing other people's music and so on. What is this going to
Not
mean?
really music.
So on,
If you're
right?
not
Like,
drumming, then you haven't really done it. But really, you can get electric guitar or a drum or whatever it is that you want.
And now I think it's just accepted that, of course, like all of these digital like sampling and so on is a part of what you can do with music. And I think we're in the same stage with AI right now. That's the first sort of Gen AI for making music that sounds mostly like a fairly bland version of music we've already heard before. But I'm sure that the creative artists will come up with really interesting things to do with that technology that will probably again change the music we listen to a lot. And that's going to be really fun to follow.
Love that answer. I'm totally a fan of that as well. And I think a lot about the dynamic music creation and what happens when UI doesn't just replace the human creator, but rather augments the human creator by being able to create great things. So I think, anyways, I had to do it. Like, I was surprised. I knew a lot about your background, the years of founding Netlify. We've known each other for quite a few years, but I didn't know that piece. And so I'm like, I have to start with that question. But let's maybe switch gears. It does have dev in the title, this podcast. So we should probably dig a bit more into the dev piece. So there's a lot to talk about when it comes to AI and the web and website building and applications and so much more. Maybe I'll start with just what sort of seems to be the most kind of eye candy type of functionality that seems around AI and the web. And that's these sort of AI website builders. I'll tell you a description and a website will come up. You see players like Vercel and Wix and Shopify and like a bunch of these others give us versions. There's like a gazillion startups that are offering this. How do you think? You've seen those. What's your opinion about these website builders that are AI generated versus not?
Actually, probably very similar to your question about music, right? Like, I think, again, the first step is that we get a lot of these like Gen AI builders that can make websites that looks like all the other websites we've built before and make them really fast, but maybe also fairly bland, right? Like,
Yeah. Just a bad
and the
version of
first
some pop song that might have existed.
Precisely, and that's probably like one of the first use cases. And there are a lot of good use cases both in music and here, right? Like maybe you need some music for your podcast and you can afford to pay some artists for royalties or something, but you can get something, right? And it can help you create, right? Like maybe you need to like at the lower end of the market, there's always been this very rich landscape of Wix and Weebly and Squarespace and all of these like site builders over time, right? That are really valuable for you want to open a pop-up restaurant and so on, right? And you definitely don't have a team of web developers going and building
Right.
something custom for you, right? The first use of these site builders will these be really useful in that space. But then similar to with music, I think the more interesting use is a more decomposed form of it, where it's not like the AI just spitting out a whole site, but where it's more about how do developers actually augment their own skill set with AI, right? And how does it allow us to build more and to build more complex things and build them faster, right? On the one hand, when we think about that space for Netlify, right, like we think of these AIs building for the web as a new kind of user of Netlify, right?
Right.
That's no longer like a human developer, but an AI developer. A while ago, we launched the Netlify GPT that you can like use from anywhere within the sort of chat GPT landscape to just like add mention Netlify and you can now publish whatever you did to the web. And just from that one, we're seeing more than 1,000 websites getting published to Netlify every day.
These are like 1,000
So
websites a day that get generated by AI. And I guess
get
those websites
generated.
are probably not, they're not your rock ballads
No,
that sort of stay for
no.
decades. They're a different
No,
flavor.
no. They're definitely often more ephemeral, or like you start some little prototype and you get it out or something, right? Or someone making a website for their girlfriend or whatever. Like it's like a lot of that kind of stuff. And similarly, we have some of these more complex site builders like Bolt.new or GPT Engineer or Devin, also using Netlify's API to make Netlify like the default way if you ask it to build an app, right? Like it builds an app on Netlify and publishes it there. From those, another set of thousands of sites created every day now on Netlify, right? So AIs are becoming a pretty big user base in a way that's really interesting, right? And that's one side of it. But then the other side of it is the whole landscape of tools that are more granular and a part of like sometimes can act as collaborators to developers, or there's like tools like Cody or Cursor or Copilot and so on that all helps developers build faster and so on. And I think the higher up in the landscape of use cases and budgets and projects, like the more you shift away from some
Yeah.
like
Magical prompt that's
click a
created.
button and or
Yeah.
make a prompt and it builds something for you that you have little control over, and into like teams of developers being augmented with all kinds of AI tooling. It's the potential of what they can do.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And I think aligned with what I'm seeing, which is there's the bootstrap exercise. And in their defense, like a lot of these tools also represent themselves that way of this is the initial version of
Yeah.
what would be used. I guess for that purpose, it's almost like a design and maybe content layout type
Yeah.
problem. And it's a good point that you make that these builders also tackle the underlying, okay, but how do you actually make this thing live on the
Yeah.
web and all that?
Yeah.
Netlify being kind
Yeah.
of a perfect example
Yeah.
for that. So many of them you see
Yeah.
them deploying on the other side.
Yeah.
And I would bet like a large percentage of them probably resort to that because they look for the known patterns that are well documented, tried and true, and also somewhat sufficiently opinionated that they route them through some path that is well trotted because there's less options around them. And so they probably have higher success with Netlify.
And you want them to set up something that doesn't require. Imagine they just built you like a Kubernetes cluster on AWS running your site, and then they're like, good luck. Now you need to figure that out. That would probably also hold them back a bit.
I think that's a really interesting point, which is AI to an extent is the laziest developer. In some ways, it is actually like a very invested developer that might, if you give it the instructions, it would not skip writing documentation or creating tests, or it would do them to varying levels of success. But it would do all those steps if instructed because it's obedient. But at the same time, it looks for things that are well trotted because at least if it wants to be useful, it seeks the sort of low maintenance type surrounding. And so it makes the ease of use that dev tools aspire to anyway, to be able to reach a lot of developers, actually very applicable to AI as well, because instructing AI or instructing LLMs is actually not that different than instructing developers en masse.
Except that developers might not be as obedient.
I don't follow the instructions that you tell them, of course.
I was CTO in a company in Spain where we built websites for small to medium businesses. We had a bunch of other things going on. The key sort of money driver was building websites for small to medium businesses at a very large scale. So at our peak, we were building more than 100 websites a week, to give you a sense of the scale, right? And had built this whole platform that did like initial brief, assigned a freelance designer to the project, took you through iterations, got it like to our platform with content management and design tooling and everything, and took it live and so on. But a big part in that process when working with like SMBs or something that wanted a website would definitely be to not be obedient.
And I guess kind of the LLMs are tricky in their desire
Yeah.
to please a little bit. I think you'll be
Yeah.
hard pressed to
Yeah.
run. So these website builders are today good examples of just generating a repetitive song of it. But I guess for that purpose, would you say that they're being effective? It sounds like they're definitely getting a lot of usage on the Netlify platform. So if we assume Netlify is a decent representation, probably is, of the number of these websites that get created.
Yeah.
Is that 1,000 number like quickly growing? Was it 100 a year ago and now it's 1,000?
A growing number also as the number of tools plugging into us just goes up, right? So we definitely seeing more and more throughput there, right? Like I still think again that a lot of it is like very ephemeral and so on, right? Like it's still not so much building real projects, building something that people might actually take over and work on and keep building on and so on. Like that's been pretty cool to see. And even from ChatGPT, right? Like we've started to see like real conversion flows where people start there and then actually sign up for Netlify with corporate email and start doing things on the other side. So there's definitely some of the things there that are starting to work. My sense is again, it's a mixture of the very low end of the market and then also just stuff where you would never build something before, right? I have an example myself, right? Like with my 18-month-old daughter, when we sit with the laptop, she'll come over and she'll see the laptop and she wants something to do with it. And she likes looking at some of the letters and numbers that she recognizes and so on. I just asked Claude to build a little game for her where it just full screen doesn't do anything, but when you press a letter, it will show that letter with a fun animation, right? And now she'll
Yeah.
come and like press letters and see them spin around and so on and be excited. And I definitely probably wouldn't have written a web app to do this, right? But it was easy enough to just ask one of these tools, like, hey, build this app, right? People have a tendency to think that there's like constant number of this type of websites that the world needs. And now AI is going to come and build this setup. And that's just not how it works. Like you make it easier to do custom development and suddenly you start custom developing things that you would just never have spent that time on before.
That would never have been created or automated. Yeah, I love that example, and I hope your daughters enjoyed that. Yeah, and I think as they get better, they don't need to be robust. They don't need to be comprehensive. They just need to be massively easy to create. And then if they work often enough, they still need to work. There needs to be, if you're always failing, you're not going to do it again. So I guess maybe let's take a step back a little bit. We already talked a little bit about the fact that you have this new breed of users in Netlify, which is these AI users. But maybe taking it a level up, how do you think about AI in Netlify?
I have these four categories to think about. Like the first one is really like how do we use AI internally at Netlify to be more effective and to build faster and better. Two, how do we make Netlify's product better by applying AI? Right? What are the opportunities that AI gives us to build a better product? And the third one is really like how does our users and customers build AI-powered applications with Netlify, and what does that change in terms of the core primitives we need to offer, the workflows we need to offer? And then the fourth one is really this category of like, how are AIs going to use Netlify, and how can we make sure that Netlify is like the best deployment platform for AIs?
I love that sort of fourth one, and we touched on it, but it's probably worthy of more information. But let's maybe go through the other three first. I think the fourth one is probably going to be helpful to inform the conversation a little bit around it. So let's go through those. I love that breakdown of the four items. So the first one was, how do you use AI to make Netlify, I guess, a better organization on it? We're talking a little bit more about development over here. So are there examples of ways in which you use AI in development that you tried out and you realize they do or they don't?
Yeah. Obviously, we're using AI in many different parts, right? But we've also really tried to see with these builders and so on, how much code can AI write for us, right? And I've tried to also internally push our developers like on make sure you go try to augment yourself with AI, because there are really powerful pieces there, right? Like I've spent time trying to build some Netlify features and just sit down and see with these different tools, how much help would they give me, right? Like I made my own conclusions there, but also just really encourage the team to use them. And I think there's the individual developer tools choice, where a lot of them are using Copilot in different ways, right? But that's also like less integrated tooling, like just ChatGPT and Claude in their own as tools and all of these phases of it, right? That's a little less ordained by us as a company and more like encouraged, like you got to figure out what works and share with the team. And then there's some of the tools we've evaluated. Are there more programmatic things we can do to our code bases where AIs can be like code developers in different ways? And we've tried different code generating systems, some of the ones that have tried to tap into a GitHub issue and try to solve it, and
Yeah,
still
like
find
pull a
that
ticket automatically or something.
yeah, and I still find that level, like the models right now, are still not at a place where that really makes sense, right? Or where they can
Yeah.
participate
They
as
don't
in
succeed
like
at a reasonable level to be worth the noise. So
no,
like,
like they're not a good enough developer that you really want them in your code base, right? If you have a not that good developer and they write a ton of pull requests, but you have to like thoroughly review all of them, and some of them might have big mistakes in them and so on, then it's not necessarily a time saver, right? Like it might just
right.
be a distraction.
I love that
More
phrasing
like
of they're just not good enough developers that you want them in your code
yeah,
base. But for the coding assistants, you don't find, at least not en masse, that it's a problem that people are checking in inferior code compared to what they did before. Like you feel like your developers are managing to supervise it sufficiently that
so
you don't see this as a repeating pattern.
yeah, and I think also because we have a strong code review culture internally, right? So I think the peer accountability there is pretty strong, right? If you suddenly start making a bunch of bad pull requests, like your peers reviewing, well, why are you doing this? As long as you have strong
Yeah.
engineering culture there, right? I think good developers will not suddenly become bad developers. Like they'll just get more productive developers, right? So that's very much something I'm encouraging.
I love that accountability piece of it, because fundamentally, the
Yeah,
more guardrails you have, the
yeah,
faster you can run, because
yeah,
you have the
totally,
confidence that you're not going to slip, and that also
totally.
incentivizes the behavior that the developers will actually have. You
Yeah,
have two effects here. One is culturally, the
yeah,
developers know that their code will be reviewed, and so maybe they themselves are more responsible. But then two is you actually have the code review process to
yeah,
identify. So I love how sometimes the use of AI highlights the importance of practices we've already perceived to be good practices. So it's
totally,
great. It's a great point.
totally. And I think it's going to be an interesting piece that I think it can make a big difference to a good developer, how good they become at AI. And that will be a pretty big differentiator, I think, in a developer, right? Because I think it's very much something you need to learn how to use and apply for it to not be like autocomplete of GitHub is often, I both see it in myself and I hear it from a lot of like more senior developers that they turn that off because it's just,
Too
I don't know,
noisy.
again, it's like pair programming with a developer that's several levels below you, and it's like constantly, okay, so let's do this differently. Let's do, and it's like noisy and so on. But on the other hand, the sort of intentional prompting for code can really speed up some of it's like things that would otherwise take really long. Like when I first were doing this, I was trying to see, could I get a GPT-4 to do some code changes on our plugin for Apache traffic server, which is like a big C++ open source code base, right? And anything more, can you implement this or something? It would just hallucinate all kinds of APIs that didn't exist and so on, right? Like it was
Right.
completely useless. But on the other hand, telling it something like, I need a function that takes getter object and then extract these specific values and then compare like the accept language string, split it up into a format that you can work with, and then compare it with the actual like setting of a redirect rule, and then return a conclusion of like, when I could give it like a really take this input, do this thing and give this output, right? Like it would just completely correctly write that function in 30
Yeah.
seconds, right? Like, and if anyone has been doing that in C++, right? Like that level of string comparison and manipulation and so on, that would have taken me a long time to
Right.
like
To do
even
the
just remember all of those like standard library functions and figure out the right way to do it in a memory safe way and so on, right? Like I just wrote it in one go. So to
yeah.
me, there's always, if you learn where you can save a ton of time and where you can waste time, and you become better and better at mastering that tool set, I think that will make a really big difference in what we see as a really strong developer in the future.
Yeah, yeah, I fully agree, and it's interesting to think about these things as specifications versus as prompts. Also, I guess these are still prompts, and it's about prompt engineering to
Yeah.
try and see how do you guide the system. I guess on one hand, you expect the LLMs to get better at needing less instruction and at describing what you want. But what people forget or underappreciate is that you do need to tell the LLM what it is that you want to do. It can't read your mind. If you just compare whatever the accept language header to one of the Western languages, maybe it defines a Western language in a different one to the one that you want. So sometimes you do need to get a little bit more specific, as a human might, as one of your developers on the team, if you give them the instructions. And you also mentioned, though, that you make good use of code mod, which I found interesting. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, like we've done evaluations of a bunch of different tools, and the one we are actually working with is codemod.com. We're especially using it to do code-based migrations. So in our main app, for example, the app.netlify.com, traditional React app started a long time ago, right? Like back in the start of 2016 or so on, right? Like, and one of the components that were pretty out of date was the React router. And it's like React router has changed a lot from like the early days to now. And those changes goes pretty deep through the whole code base. And at the same time, like being stuck on an old version was holding back a lot of other upgrades of React dependencies and so on. So that was one of the big projects that we use code mod to do, like
And code mod
really
is
massive.
a defined, like by itself, it is a deterministic manipulation of code to
Yeah. So code mod, like
often used to go from version 1 to version 2 or from version
precisely.
1 to version.
The idea with the tool is just taken on the basic idea that you can write code mods that doesn't look at that are not find and replace in text, right? But that looks at the abstract syntax tree of your code and then can apply transformations to that abstract syntax tree, right? Like a lot of these kind of migrations can then be expressed as a set of code mods, right? Because again, if you try to do it with search and replace, that's just not going to work, right? But there is a set of like code mods that can express how do you go from how the router worked in this place to how it's supposed to work in this place, right? Like now the challenge is that writing like transformations of abstract syntax trees that's not
Not
super
fun. Yeah,
trivial.
any junior developer can come along and start kind of
No, no.
those things.
And so that's where code mod is really helping us get the AI to define and iterate and test on those code mods. So once those are in place, then based on that, their system will essentially like apply that throughout the code base and make some pretty gnarly big pull requests that we didn't have to run a lot of testing on to make sure it works and so on. But that has actually really allowed us to run through that whole series of updates to React Router and then the React versions that were behind because of that dependency and so on. So that's actually some pretty big, in terms of lines of code, some pretty massive
Significant
contributions to our code base that's come in that path through AI, but with a lot of human in the loop style.
Very
right?
attended
Like
process of it. Yeah. I like that analogy because I do think there is a pattern that you see in places in which if you ask AI to generate something that is a more constrained space, it can do a better job. Actually, in the world of web, there's also WASP introduced this thing called Mage, which is a GPT generator. Actually, you just described Netlify GPT. And so if you're giving the LLMs instructions of something that is a much more small, well-defined space, it might still be complicated, but there are less options around it. There aren't 17,000 ways to do a loop. There aren't also some like things are much more contained, that it generally can do a pretty good job. And so this pattern of having the LLM generate something that is that confined space, because that's really what you want, and then applying that to code seems to be working. I've seen it in the DevOps space, I've seen it in WASP. So it's really interesting to see how it applies to code mode. Is this something you built in-house, or is this code mode? The code mode itself is an open source project, I think originally created in Facebook. It was before Meta. Now there's something around it.
Yeah, precisely. Alex, there was a PM on that product at Facebook or that project there, right? Like he's built codemod.com around it and have both like this registry of open source code mods that you can apply if you like. He's starting to work with teams like the React team or the Remix teams to just like when they launch a new version and they have a set of code mods that you can just go apply to your code base and upgrade it. And that's really interesting, right? Full disclosure, I'm also a small investor now in the company, but also because I think it's really interesting because those kind of version upgrades over time, it's a challenge of our whole ecosystem, right? Like that all of these versions keeps changing. And either you can waste a lot of developer time like chasing them. And on the other hand, if you don't do that, suddenly you run into these moments where you're now blocked because you're like pretty far behind, and getting really up to date is now like some massive lift, right? But you might not be able to add like a new
Right.
dependency or something before you've lifted up those old dependencies. So I think
Yeah.
if we can build tooling that can really help, like systematically helping on that, like just dependency migration problem, that's really valuable, right? Like
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
can really,
Agreed. A lot of good insights about using to make Netlify's own development more productive. I guess the next point you made was around the notion of using AI to make Netlify products better. Maybe
yeah,
actually before we go there, can you give us, just for the users who are not as familiar with Netlify, give us
yeah.
just a couple of minutes on what Netlify is and what you have, just to contextualize the AI use in it.
Yeah, so Netlify is a web development platform for the web, really based on like their original insight was that if you really decoupled your architecture, so you thought about all of your backend business logic and APIs and systems just as a set of APIs, and then thought of the actual web user experience as like a self-standing application, then we could really deliver like a unified platform that takes care of all the automation and operation that you need to make sure that the code your developers write gets in front of actual customers
Mhm.
on a domain in production as fast as possible and with high performance and high upgrade, right? So we tightly integrate all the release management, the CI/CD, and like the setting up staging environments for every single pull request, and like giving you collaborative tools on top of that, even giving you tools for non-developers to be part of the process and give feedback into pull requests or do visual editing even on top of the website and so on with the actual operation of the infrastructure, right? So we operate a large global network and with everything you would expect there, like web application firewall, DDoS mitigation. We have like edge compute and serverless compute for both sort of like the edge rendering you might need for modern frameworks or for personalization, and for all the backend for front end, you'll
Mhm.
need to actually talk to all of these different APIs and build on top of them. Really just with the goal of helping web teams avoid spending their time on all the automation and operation that sits after they write their code and content, and focus on like actually like creating the code and content that makes a difference. And then we'll take it from there and help them ship faster and with better results.
And I think a very powerful platform, and I think one of its distinctions as well compared to maybe other players in the space, which is it is quite, you already used I think the words composable earlier on,
Yeah.
which is it's opinionated, it has those paths and it offloads them, but you can say I'm going to use this piece of the platform over here, I'm going to plug into something else, and
Yeah.
here there might be like 7 different ways in which I
Yeah.
publish the content, or I write the content, or 5 CMSs that I integrate with the
Yes.
different apps, and you create those. So this composability, modularity of the system is a core strength of it, right? It's just relevant, I think, to some of the AI features that
Yeah.
you've been discussing. So thanks for that sort of primer. So I guess indeed take us into that world. So how do you use AI to make the Netlify products better?
Yeah, so our philosophy is really like that we don't go into the space of using AI to help write your code or write your content or anything like that, right? Like in our world, that's what is like outside the wall of Netlify, right? But we help you take that stuff live faster. So we're constantly thinking about like how can AI help on those, reduce the friction from when you write the code or when you write the content to having it on a UL in production. And one of the first sort of like public features we launched there sort of explicitly was the why did it fail button, just based on the fact that one of the most common friction is like you've written some code, you push it to a pull request on GitHub. We run the build for that code, but instead of going live, the build fails. And now you get it like, it failed. I got to jump into Netlify, got to look at all the logs, got to try to figure out like what happened and what should I do about it, right? So there we put a button in the UI that you can click that said, why did it fail? And when you click that, we'll take the context of the build and the build log and so on, pass it through an LLM and try to answer like, why did this fail? And give you also a proposed solution. What if
What
that's
can
the
you do about
reason?
it?
What can you
Yeah.
do?
Love that
What can
very
you do about it? Right?
practical kind of sifting through data, but with a critical eye
Precisely.
that
Right.
now LLMs enable to understand what happened and saving me a lot of time in the process.
Yeah, and we launched that sometime in May this year, and since then we've had more than 100 built debugs by that button. That's 25,000 developer hours saved since then, or something. So,
And do
so
you know
that
like the accuracy rate of it, of those 150,000 times? Like
I,
how often did it get it right versus wrong?
I wish I had better numbers there, right? Like it's a little harder for us to instrument, if even to know again, because it's not like we also have a button to say implement the fix, right? Like it is still like giving you the advice on how to fix it and why did it fail. So that's not like a surefire us to measure did they take that advice or did they do something else.
Yeah. But these are developers, so if you get it wrong very often, they will tell you.
They will tell us. And quite the contrary. We've even seen that internally just when we started in private beta, our own team started using it a lot. As all of these, it definitely sometimes gets it wrong, right? But there's also just a lot of times where it just saves you.
Yeah.
Like in some cases, it might even be something that's fairly obvious, but you get like a large build output log with error messages and so on, and you got to just situate yourself and figure it out. And you just click that button that just immediately it's identified it. It's like a very nice feeling.
Yeah.
So-
No, that's a lot of time saved. So that one is like a very concrete, immediate. I
Very-
love the practicality of it. Yeah. And it feels very applicable to other systems, those built-in sort of systems around.
Precisely. And said also like our core philosophy of how do we think about AI in our tool set, right? Like ideally not writing prompts against like you can do that other places, but ideally we should have everything wired up so we can have these do things that doesn't add complexity to your workflow, but just like speeds up how you work.
Yeah.
And the next feature we just launched here at Compose that's in private beta now is what we call AI assisted publishing. And it ties into, we are obviously like very much a developer first tool, right? And we're really meant for teams that want to apply developers to build web experiences. But we've always had this vision that like those developers have a set of stakeholders that are not developers that are core part of their web team, right? The marketeers that write the actual like copy and content and the messaging that needs to go live, the designers that work with them on the assets and so on. And we only really succeed for our customers if we can help those developers help the full team, right? And we can make the full path faster. And when we look at a lot of the web project, you will have code and templates, and then typically you will always have some content infrastructure behind it, right? Like typically like headless CMSs. Maybe sometimes you even have a couple. You have a headless CMS and you have an e-commerce platform. Sometimes you have a legacy CMS and like modern headless CMS and an
All
e-commerce
sorts of
platform.
combinations.
So
It's like technology never dies. You layer on something new, but you never actually remove the old.
But the key is that for developers to make effective use of content, they need that content to be in a structured, queryable format. And that's like ideally in some modern headless CMS with great content in, right? Like now, in our experience, even internally at Netlify, none of the creators and marketeers and so on ever do their creative work in structured content. They always seem to work at Netlify, they work at Google Docs or Notion, right? Anything, whether even developers, right? If one of our developers a new blog post for our dev hub, they don't write it in.
Yeah, it's hard to write.
Like
You don't want to write it in a form. You want to write it in some free form.
You just want to write it free form. So it's always just like Notion is typically where the developer once gets written and the marketeers typically write this in Google Docs, right? And there's just the split there. Like similar to how one of the early things we did at Netlify was like realizing that developers have this set of tools with their code editor, their local development environment in GitHub where they do the actual work. And then there's all this tooling after that for getting it out into the world. We early on realized we could just plug into GitHub and just make sure that every time the developer pushes to GitHub, we run a build and we give them a URL when they can see how it looks like. We started thinking about what would it look like to expand this to these stakeholders that work in Google Doc and Notion and so on, right? Like in this kind of the early path towards that, where we say, if you want to publish a new page, whether it's like a simple blog post or whether it's like a product page that might have a whole set of complex templates and so on. Instead of like first writing all of that up in Google Docs and then typically going and asking like a developer or some semi-technical person or something that was just like doing CMS entry or something, go put this into the CMS. We can get the LLM to do that for you. Like just go to Netlify visual editing layer and just say, start a new page from this document, right? And then we use the LLM to take that unstructured content and get it into the structured format. We already set in this space where we can run the full since we're the rendering infrastructure and so on, right? Like we can run the preview for you and show how it actually looks like. And we can then give you the visual editing on top of that to make tweaks to anything like the LLM might have gotten wrong or you want to change and so on, like straight on the page. And again, just really aim to like, can we take that process that sometimes even takes a couple of days, not like of intense work, but you got to find someone that has time to put it into the CMS, and then they got to set it up,
Yeah.
and then they send you back a link, and then you have to find the time to go verify that link, and then there's some iterations and so on. Can we shorten that to just, can we get that down to just like a 15-minute session and you're live, right?
Yeah. I think
So that's what we're working on there.
yeah, really like that. And I guess I think of it as like an entry point to development and platform. So structured is basically all the
Yeah.
prelude to code needs
Yeah.
structure.
Yeah.
Can I simplify that? And I think aligned with market trends that we're seeing with the whiteboarding solutions, with these others in which you can describe something in or loose form and can evolve it into something more rigid, more structured on it. Great uses inside, great uses in the product. Thanks for describing all of those. We probably should talk a tiny bit about how do customers build on AI, although here in the podcast, we're mostly focusing on how do you develop applications with AI versus on top of AI. But maybe use a couple of words on that and then a couple of words on that AI user that we talked about before, mostly around what is it that you do to improve, acknowledging this as a user, what is it that you
Yeah. So in terms of obviously like developers building with Netlify, as AI just becomes a more and more key building block of every user experience we build, it will be like more and more integral to all developers, that a lot of their content or data or whatever they need might come from AI systems, right? Like for AI workflows. So of course we're thinking a lot about what does that in this kind of Jamstack architecture with like front end and back end for the front end and so on. What are the new primitives that we might have to build, or how might our primitives needs to evolve to keep making sure that building on top of these AIs are a really great experience, right? And that's been things we've already done, like making sure that all of our originally Netlify functions were totally synchronous, right? Like you would send a request to the function and then when it was done, would send your response, right? Like it became really important to add streaming responses to functions because typically if you build on top of GPT-4 or something, you're not going to get like an instant response. You're instead going to get some stream of tokens that you want to, that takes long enough to generate that you want to stream it back to the user.
Yeah, the experience is terrible if you don't stream it in the world of LLM.
Totally, right. And then you also start seeing these more complex patterns where it becomes more like agents and assistants, where it becomes less of, okay, send one request to an LLM and stream it back, but where it becomes more these types of workflows, right? Get some stuff from the user. Now you got to trigger an initial prompt with an LLM that might give you like a planning stage or something like that. And then you might even need to spin up several different like processes to do those different steps in parallel. And once all of those are done, you can update the end result. But meanwhile, as they go, you want to show updates to the user and so on. So we're thinking a lot about how does that change what the code you write for that look like and how it can make it run. And at Compose, when we built the AI assisted publishing feature, we ran into a lot of that ourselves, right? And since we're building it on Netlify, one of our principal engineers built this whole sort of workflow engine on top of our normal serverless primitives of scheduled functions and blob storage and serverless compute and so on. So we also packaged that up as an extension for asynchronous workloads to, again, make it really simple for our users to write those kind of workloads when they're dealing with LLMs. And I think that's another way forward that we're just constantly thinking about, right? For where we sit in the space, what are the tools that look different, that might not have been that important before, but that's becoming really important once you're building these type of experiences.
And it fits into the feature is already here, but not evenly distributed. It's, none of these are like entirely new capabilities. These are all things that existed, but they went from being an edge case to being a common case. And so you have to support them a bit more inherently. And I guess it's interesting to think about the notion of an LLM interaction on your site being maybe as prevalent as a database call.
I'm looking at a lot of things like local first architectures for building web apps, again, because those are more of an edge case now for if you're building like multiplayer experiences and so on. But again, it's suddenly much more normal that like in all of these workflows and so on, you have these agents going off and doing stuff. Then almost every web experience we build are going to be a multiplayer experience. The other players are just not humans, but these agents doing stuff, right? But architecturally, it means that suddenly a lot of those things that were like an edge case in the past could quickly suddenly become a really common, I need to have this.
Yeah, very interesting to think about how these use cases become as prevalent as querying data,
Yeah,
or how do they become common enough in applications that are not
yeah,
deemed complex, the
yeah,
application
yeah,
in general, but they now have these
yeah,
LLMs. So the three of the four, in each of those, there's a lot to say around the use of AI to accelerate development in Netlify, about how do you use AI to make your own products better, about how do you build AI into Netlify applications. I'm interested about that fourth bit, which frankly, I didn't think about that deeply until we've started having the conversation ahead of this episode, which is all these AI users you mentioned that are using Netlify. So we already described a bunch of these tools, a bunch of these builders already use Netlify by default. What is it that you can do as Netlify to help promote that? Generally, that's a good thing. You want them to be able to successfully use Netlify, but you
yeah.
definitely want them to do that by default. If you're building a tool that you want AI to use, which is not the same as building an AI tool, what can you do? Have you tried things that you've already seen work better than others?
When I built even the predecessor to Netlify called Biilmann, that was like the first step into this. Like, how do you build these like decoupled front end? The first tagline way back then, like in the end of 2013 or something, was back then like hosting for the programmable web. Right, that got replaced pretty quickly and so on. But there was this idea of like outside of users building with Netlify. Netlify is also in itself kind of an API with CLI and a tool set, right? Like in an open API spec and so on. Like our app.netlify.com is mainly just like a client-side client on top of that. Our CLS is another, CLI is another client on top of that, right? That kind of now just turns out to be a really useful thing for AI models wanting to interact with our product, right? There's like a clear, this is how you should use this as an AI. The other path that like other things have been this flow. We launched it a long time ago, but that's suddenly starting to become more relevant. That's like a deploy now, claim later, where you'll see that flow very clearly if you try to like bolt.new, right? And you go in and ask it to build an app and you say deploy and it'll just deploy to Netlify. It won't ask you as an end user at first, like you need to go authenticate with Netlify and so on. It'll just deploy you there. But it will give you a link that says, if you actually want to do something with this, you can click through and you can then claim the site and it'll get added to your Netlify account, right?
So
Now
remove
the
the
link is
friction of
established.
saying, do I have a Netlify account, or do I?
Precisely, right? Removing the friction from these AI tools to just be the user first and then potentially hand what they build over to a human. When you're building these tools, you want people to just start and play around. You don't want them to first like log into a whole bunch of different services and then they can do something, right? So anything we can do to reduce that big friction and make sure that the AI can have its own account in a way and
Mm,
just work there and then give it to a user when it's done. More like almost thinking a little bit about some of these in a similar way if we're thinking about like how freelancers and agencies need to use our platform and what we need to build from that, right? Like these AIs are kind of a new kind of like
right.
team player like that, right? And we got to
Yeah.
think through what does that mean for the flows of how you build with our app, right? So that's both that programmatic aspect of obviously if you don't have a clearly CLI or API driven flow that is easy for these AIs to tap into, then they can't do much, right? But then there's
Right.
also this human aspect of the flow, right? What
Of
does
the
these
registration. Yeah.
workflows look like?
And
Yeah,
not just human. So it sounds like great docs, which I guess you minimally alluded to. It's well documented by
yeah,
you that to
totally.
begin with, very programmable with good examples
Yeah,
of it. And then subsequently, zero friction on registration, which actually feels very important for LLMs, because I think for a user, their ownership of their email to register for different accounts is still
yeah,
friction, but it's like relatively low friction. But I can definitely see how for an AI
yeah,
system, the fact that they need to register, they have no email, but has
yeah,
no email on behalf of
no,
this user. And so the
no,
registration is a big deal, and removing that is significant. All of those are great things. I can see how they
yeah,
make
yeah.
AI successful as users of Netlify. Are there things after you've learned that AIs are using your system that you've tried to change? Because all of those are things where I don't want to say got lucky, like you planned well or you designed
Yeah, yeah,
yourself correctly for the
yeah,
programmable web. Are there
yeah.
things you've tried since
Yeah,
that
I
you've seen to
mean,
be successful?
I think there are more things that we're still trying to work through for these different providers, right? There's, for example, work with ChatGPT, like one of the flows we use when you publish there is that if you don't claim the site, we treat it as ephemeral and it's deleted within an hour or something like that, right? So to keep that. But then there are other of these systems where people still don't want to claim, but want to make it like shareable and so on. So they don't want it to go away And once we have that, then we need to start also working around all the bad things that comes from that, of what happens when someone jumps into one of these LLMs and asks them to make something that looks like chase.com and ask people to put in their credit card, right? And how do we work on notifying the user of the service that has the AI that their user is doing bad things with us and so on. So again, there's a lot of these problems that are not as straight up like technical limitation, but broader.
Super interesting.
Then I think other pieces of it is more on the composable side, right? Because then there's, again, when these tools want to build with, one thing is like the simpler examples now are just pure front end apps and don't do anything more, right? But when they also want both a front end and a database somewhere else, and like these more plugged together systems where multiple partners come together, there I think there's some things to think through that's almost more like, how can we start standardizing on some of these patterns across providers, right? Like, how can we, like, are there ways we can use the open web to make it clear what we allow an AI to do, and how we can be used by AIs as tools? And are there ways we can make standards for how AIs can compose those tools together? I think that's like the next frontier in a lot of this. That will probably happen first in proprietary walled gardens, right? Like where inside
you can name all the different pieces that
you can name all the different pieces, then they can all be tied together. But I think it's pretty important, if this is going to be a really important way of building and starting and so on, it's going to be really important that we find ways centered around the open web to solve these problems equally. Like ideally, probably as it always is, right? Like in forms that are probably a little more clunky than in one walled garden, but that are also fundamentally really open and allows anyone to publish and participate in this composable like economy of tools that AIs can plug together and build with, right?
Yeah, and connect. So that's a great lead into maybe using the last sort of 10 minutes or so of our conversation to talk about where this is headed. This has been great insights on how significantly AI interweaves into everything that you do. I think we would both agree that where we're headed, this is just getting started. This is just the beginning. So maybe take out your crystal ball and say, as you think about your world, this world of the web, maybe specific a Jamstack, the composable web, in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, maybe even further, what would you say are the primary changes that you are anticipating?
The reason that people start like thinking about composable architecture, in opposition to buying some monolithic tool for, here's a monolith for building your corporate.com, or here's like a monolith for building your e-commerce, or here's like all of those. The reason people start thinking about like composable as a term and a category that they want to adopt is, on the one hand, to get flexibility in the experiences they can build, right? Like you want to be able to apply custom development to build some custom experience, but you want to be able to do it with fast time to market and without building the parts of the experience that are not unique to you, right? So if you're like a high-end luxury brand, you want to build a very tailored like web experience for your e-commerce that represents that, but you don't necessarily want to build e-commerce, right? Like you don't want to build like content storage for that. So you want to be able to take like reusable components, put them together there, and then build really fast on top of them. And you want to know that those different components you pick, you can evolve them independently as the world evolves and as different alternatives comes along, where in the traditional monolith, you got stuck with maybe some areas it was best in class, but then a lot of areas that it sucked and you couldn't do anything about that. So that's what motivates that shift. And I think the big market trends around AI will accelerate the need for those, like for going composable, right? And there's like, the first reason for that is just like, a lot of things are hard to predict around AI, but what's really easy to predict is that it will accelerate everything, right? Like you'll get more content, you'll get more code, you'll get more assets.
Yeah, and a natural reaction of reducing, as we've touched on before, the barrier of entry, the barrier of the efforts to create. So more will be created.
More of everything, right? And that means faster evolving tool sets. And again, like that just puts more pressure on sitting on like some large monolith. It also puts more pressures on typically the rollout processes that comes when like your UI and your backend is tied together and everything might be like more risky to roll out and so on, right? So you need systems that can deliver very high throughput and very high flexibility and so on, right? But then the other sort of more major thing that I'm thinking through is really what I would call like UI 2.0, right? Like where right now, all of that acceleration from AI, we're just using it to build the same user experiences that we built the last decades faster. Right? So we're not really like doing anything massively new, but we're making the code and the asset and the designs and everything faster. Right.
Right.
And that feels like just the first step. Even tying back to that opening question
Yeah.
on music, right? Like the same, right? We'll just like make the same pop songs but faster, right? Like,
Yeah,
but
and
I
that
think
itself is a change because,
it
as we
is.
just said, it would
Yeah,
create more
yeah,
content in places that couldn't be created before, just like it can create music in places, more maybe customization and such, faster pace of change, but it's still not new creations. It's just a faster moving beast, which
yeah,
once again is another compounding. You could say DevOps has
yeah,
done that, and
yeah,
cloud has done
yeah,
that, and Java has
yeah.
done that. All these things have,
Yes,
JavaScript has done
yes,
that. They keep
yes.
compounding on the pace of development, in this case,
Totally.
also
Right.
content creation as well.
Totally. So the pace goes up. But I think if we look broader out into the next 5 to 10 years, then we'll see much more radical change, right? Like in the sense that gradually we'll start figuring out like what kind of user experiences is it we can build when, especially when the core constraints that we've had on all human computer interfaces since the first one, that's really like that computers can't just understand intent or something, right? Like you need very transactional and predictable interactions. You click a button, the computer does a predictable
Right.
thing. You type a command, the computer does what the command says, right? Like, and that constraint is just seeping away, right? Like into, you can actually just, it can understand intent and go do a bunch of things, right? And the only way we've really exploited that yet is in like in chatbot interfaces, right? That feels very primitive, right? And I think that's the part that's the most impossible to predict how it will unfold. But I think it's easy to predict that it will unfold, right? That we'll start seeing people come up with these patterns of user experiences that you could never have built without AI, that were just not possible, right? And we'll see that even changing possibly the landscape of the devices and the hardware we use to interact with computers with as those possibilities change, right? And that will be really fundamental. Like that I think will be as big a change to what you're supposed to be building at on the web as mobile was, possibly even bigger. And
Right.
similar to every other platform change, that there will be like lots like the actual stuff you will need to build. Like it was impossible to predict when the iPhone came out, like what are the things like 5 years
Right.
after that people will be building as apps, right? But in every one of those platform changes, there's also some things that are very predictable, right? And one of them is just like this tension between closed platforms and open platforms, right? Where obviously large players will have a strong interest in this replatforming being to proprietary platforms that they own and control end to
Right.
end with
They're all
walled
targets.
gardens that they can monetize. And then a lot of us will have to try to fight for an open web alternative to that that can still deliver the kind of experiences that users will suddenly start to expect, right? So that whole cycle that's happened with mobile and with social media and with all of those, I think it's just about to start really playing out again. I think that's going to be like one of the key areas where we as Netlify are really thinking about, like for developers, how can we keep making the web the right platform to innovate and build these new experiences on, and how can we keep the type of qualities the web has around like creative chaos where there's no gatekeeper and you can just buy a domain and build whatever you want in that domain and put it in
Right.
front of people, right? Like how can we make those strengths really compelling, so we keep this like open shared infrastructure the best platform to build from.
Yeah, no, that's a really astute observation, and I agree that it's a risk that we have to deal with. And I guess we're seeing it on all layers of the LLMs, all the way from at the bottom, the foundation models
Yeah,
themselves versus open weights versus
yeah,
a few that are open source properly, but then also further up, indeed, with if you were to build an application, even these autonomous
yeah,
engineers and such, they might be very compelling. But what does it mean for the development methodology over here? For most of them, we don't know the answer because they're still behind a wall. They're not publicly available. But the sentiment is that those are, hey, you're going to commit to this platform. It's going to be more the Microsoft of old, or the, I don't
yeah,
know, Borland type
yeah.
environment. It wouldn't necessarily be the Open Java or the
No,
subsequently JavaScript and Open Web. So it's interesting because I think there's a good chance that in a closed system, you can produce innovations faster and create things that are cohesive faster. And they will probably happen and they will have an advantage, but we just need to not accept that as the destination, but rather as a stepping stone. Matt, this has been an excellent conversation, longer than most of our conversations because there's just so much to say. Thanks again for coming in and sharing these observations and exciting stuff on the Netlify front. Especially, I really love how the investments in appealing to a broad developer base have drawn in this new coder, this new creature, names the
Yeah.
AI,
Yeah.
but a lot of other guidance as well. So thanks for coming on to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. This was a lot of fun, really great conversation.
And thanks everybody for tuning in. And I hope you join us for the next one.
Thanks for tuning in. Join us next time on the AI Native Dev, brought to you by Tesla.